Okay, so we're back and we're continuing to discuss the charcoal trade and its impact on the environment. Okay, so we had mentioned a couple slides back about soil erosion and how serious of an impact that has on the environment. As you can see in this picture, this is an example of how serious soil erosion can be in arid environments like Somalia. The monsoon season in Somalia, like I had mentioned, is between April and June. But of course, with climate change, they're noticing that that's changing as well. The monsoon season is shifting to pretty much unpredictable events or non-existent. So in some cases, Somalia doesn't even have a monsoon season. So their rainy season just continues to be a dry season, which can be really harsh on the environment if there's no rainfall, clearly. But when it does rain, and normally in a normal year, Somalia will receive upwards of 20 inches of rain a year. So it can come really fast and last for a few days and just dump rain very quickly. And if the environment is denuded of all vegetation, like we're seeing in this image here, it can have some pretty serious impacts on the landscape. So you can see here a huge gully has been created as a result of soil erosion. So the landscape is changing from what was once large areas with acacia plantations or forests, I should say, and much more of a pastoral existence for the people living there locally to something that looks a lot more like this, where people aren't able to bring their animals to herd there. It's too dangerous. So they're being forced to areas that are getting even more heavily overgrazed. And of course, that's denuding the environment even further and just exacerbating the situation. So, large amounts of Somalia are starting to see gully formations occurring when it rains. But I think their biggest problem really is the fact that they're getting very unpredictable rainfall patterns occurring now as a result of climate change. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the acacia tree. These are the trees that are most commonly found in Somalia, and these are the trees that are being taken for harvest. So the deforestation, of course, is occurring, and there's also a lack of replanting. So many of the species that are found in this area, one species in particular, is now an endangered species. So it's been listed on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List as a threatened species, and that's Acacia boozii. And so not only are the species being endangered, but the fact that they're being removed is changing the landscape as well. Acacia trees are evergreen and they're drought tolerant indigenous trees to the area. And traditionally, these were the areas where people would bring their livestock to graze on the land. These trees provided feedstock to pastoralists, and they helped them stay resilient to droughts because they provided shade for the animals, and their deep roots would bring water to the surface, so shallow wells could be dug and livestock could find areas to drink in those areas. So the fact that they're being taken away is severely impacting the lifestyle and the livelihood of the people that are living in those areas. These particular species, acacia, are really drought tolerant and grazing tolerant, so they're well adapted to their environment. And they also provide habitat for other species. There are some species of birds, for example, that nest primarily in acacia trees. The weaver birds will preferentially choose acacia trees to nest in. And so we're starting to see now that there's this huge pressure on the environment for suitable habitat for these species of birds as well. And so instead of having one or two birds nest in a single tree, you're starting to see whole flocks of these birds nesting in a tree, which then also puts a strain on the remaining trees that are left in the habitat. So either they're felled for charcoal or they're left standing and they're just being pretty much denuded by the birds that are nesting in them. So yes, the charcoal trade has reduced this pasture space and compromised the livelihoods of pastoralists. So people are really being pushed out of their traditional lifestyles and being forced to participate in other forms of employment. So what would you do if you can't make a living anymore with your livestock? You'll have to find another way to make an income, and chopping down a tree on your land and selling it for $11 seems like a really good idea, right? So a lot of times the social structure is changing, people are being forced into positions like this that they're not all that jazzed about, but are feeling forced into it, if you will. So if we look at, why is this not okay? So if we look at the actual numbers, and by the way, it was kind of hard to get real good data on this. It seems as though a lot of it is not being reported. Not many people are obviously going to Somalia to do the forestry work that we would have in other countries. So it was really difficult for me to find hard and fast numbers that were relatively recent. A lot of it was from the 1990s or early 2000s, but these were the statistics that I found in terms of deforestation rates. So we're looking at about 35,000 hectares of land, of acacia land, that is being deforested per year in Somalia. And there is very little reforestation going on. So obviously the replacement rate of these acacia trees is practically non-existent, except for a few programs that have been up and running, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the latest estimate that I could find was that about 20,000 square miles of forest have been taken in Somalia that have been directly used in the charcoal trade. So some action has been taken to try and reduce the impact of the charcoal trade or make it more sustainable. And in 2016, various UN agencies, including the United Nations Development Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the UN Environment, they launched an initiative to promote the international cooperation in the support of the ban that was put on the charcoal trade by the Security Council. So there have been some attempts made to reduce the at least the trade. And if we look in terms of where Somalia sits, there was a UN report that came out at the global ranking of the vulnerability of countries to the impact of climate change. And Somalia ranked 7th out of 233 countries and regions as being one of the most vulnerable in terms of the climate change impact. So now would not be the time for them to maintain their charcoal trade and cutting down more trees. In fact, the opposite should be done, but due to lack of government structure and the war-torn environment, it's just not happening. There's just not the leadership and oversight to try to address this issue. So it's exacerbating the changing livelihoods of Somalians, moving from pastoral lifestyles to more working in the charcoal trade. So in 2013, the UN Joint Programme for Sustainable Charcoal Reduction and Alternative Livelihoods was launched. And it's very difficult to find out any information about this besides the press releases that talked about the programme and the sustainable charcoal reduction. The two things that were really pivotal in this program was the idea of creating new jobs, job revitalization. So moving away from the illegal charcoal trade to finding alternative jobs for people. and reforestation. So the Food and Agriculture Organization, they aimed to plant 4,000 trees in Mogadishu. But that's the extent of it. I couldn't find an update. I couldn't find any real figures as to, well, how did they do? What was the results? How did the program fare? Did they achieve what they wanted to? It was really difficult to find anything that had any substantive information. And it's even mentioned in your book. So on page 130, it talks about how it's really difficult to find information. And when I read that, I started looking myself, maybe thinking there'd be an update, but I couldn't find anything either, except for the launch of this initiative. So it seems as though action is limited, right? There's the idea that they want to do something, but when it comes to really having government officials involved in the programs, it falls flat because of the instability of the government, and the political structure that they have in Somalia doesn't seem like it's a likely endeavor for it to continue. Okay. So the UN Security Council in February of 2012, they banned the export of Somalian charcoal to other countries, saying it provided significant revenue to the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab. And the UN Security Council also approved expanding the African Union mission in Somalia from 12,000 to just over 70 or almost 18,000 troops, with the idea to buttress the weak Somali government against Al-Shabaab rebels. And the African Union mission is a peacekeeping mission operated by the African Union with the approval of the United Nations Security Council. So we know that the charcoal trade, as I think was mentioned by Dr. Eager, is actually a significant revenue for the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab. They earn about $150 million from the charcoal trade directly, because they tax each bag of charcoal. They tax about $2 for each bag that's shipped to the Gulf states and to Kenya. So in the 2018 report by the monitoring group, which is the UN group that's monitoring the charcoal trade, the monitoring group on Somalia estimated that charcoal exports declined about 25%, with total exports around 3 million bags, or around $150 million of wholesale value. So the whole industry, though, estimates to be around $250 to $384 million annually. So no doubt the illegal trade is continuing because Al-Shabaab is in control of the ports, so they are able to go and control the export of the charcoal, and are taxing people from their operations. So the book offers some positive examples of how small-scale reforestation programs and regularization of the trade elsewhere in Africa has succeeded, and has actually shown some pretty good results. So, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the World Wildlife Fund for Nature ended up running a sustainable charcoal program quite successfully. And they were able to reforest an area of about 9,000 hectares of forest that was part of their reforestation program. And what ended up happening was this undermined the illegal trade of charcoal. And so people then would move away from the illegal trade back to a more sustainable approach to charcoal. So for it to be a success, there needs to be multiple local, national, international actors involved. The charcoal trade isn't going to go away. That's a fact. It'll continue for as long as there are acacia trees, quite frankly. So the environmental destruction and the political instability are likely to continue. So we have to find a solution, right? So my question to you would be, should the industry be made legal and resources made available to make the practice more sustainable? And what I'd like to do now is take that question to the discussion board on Blackboard and have you guys participate in that question. And I'll also post maybe one other question for you to give your ideas. So that concludes this short lecture on the charcoal trade. Hopefully you've read the chapter 5. It goes into a lot more detail than I have in these 2 15-minute videos, but absolutely take a look at that. There's material in there that I haven't covered in this presentation just because of the scope of where I was going with this, looking more at it from an environmental impact standpoint. But so I will post something now on the Blackboard discussion board and continue this discussion there.